cranking it out. We're getting there. Element 22, data validation and usability. The first thing to remember is this element just needs to list the requirements for how you will determine data validity and usability, and so how you know your data are usable. This element 22 outlines the requirements, and then the next element 23 outlines the method. So this and the next element are tied together and should be relatively short. So the first thing you have to have are these definitions, which I think are arcane and unneeded and should be simplified, but for now. Verification basically means checking to make sure your SOPs were followed. Like, did what is described in this checklist actually happen? And you verify that using documentation. And then validation is we're going to use this data to determine if we need to conduct dust abatement procedures on this stretch of road during the high traffic season, and are the data usable for answering that question? So that's what validation is, but they're really pretty much related because you write your SOPs so that your data can be used to answer a question. But for now, these two things are split apart, and you just need to provide these definitions and demonstrate that you have an understanding of this specifically for your data. And again, this has the requirements. So this element is basically going to be, we are going to ask these questions to determine data usability. And then in the next element 23, you're going to say, this is how we will answer those questions to determine data usability. So you have to step back and think big picture. So not just like, was the average of my fourth highest concentrations each year over a particular value? No. Think about everything that's going on, other sources of the same pollutant, conditions that would cause changes in that pollutant concentration, and what your question is, and are you able to answer that question looking at, for example, important things like the sampling design. So where are you measuring and how often are you measuring is mostly the sampling design. Are you even gathering the correct thing? Should you be gathering data over a 24-hour period as opposed to one hour period? Sample handling, make sure you do your research before you write your SOPs and jump into the study. It's very tempting to jump in, and that's the whole point of writing these quality assurance project plans, so you don't make these mistakes. Analytical procedures, are you asking the laboratory or your instruments to do the analyses that you want? Calibration procedures, instruments that are out of calibration, and usually that's after 12 months since the last calibration, but for whatever it is for your measurements, you make sure that you ask the question, is it within calibration? And then QC procedures, you have to do some sort of check of something during the project. Flow rate, temperature, pressure, those can be easily compared to handheld standards. There's excellent companies online with really cool instruments that aren't that expensive. And then data reduction and processing procedures. So data reduction means taking 1,000,000 rows of data and reducing them into something that you can understand. Usually average concentrations over a time period, or averaged over several sites, for example in a water body, or however you're doing your summary statistics, that's reducing the data and then processing it. Then we'll upload it into this other database. And remember, this element 22 just has to say, we will look at our data reduction and processing procedures to make sure that they're conforming to the QAPP and industry standards. So this is just the requirements, which is that we will look at these and answer these questions. Specifically, we will ask these questions of our data and our quality system. So how do we know the sampling design conforms to EPA requirements? Well, we have an auditor come out once every 12 months. How do we know that sample collection procedures are adequate? We follow the SOPs provided by the manufacturer. Do we have procedures in place to verify that the SOPs have been followed? Yes, because we have an auditor who comes once every 12 months and reviews all our procedures. Or yes, because we do informal assessments with another organization in our PQAO, or whatever it is, where you've devised some sort of system to verify that the procedures are actually being followed. Do we have procedures that ensure sample integrity? So that's chain of custody. Basically, you need to follow whatever the requirements are of your laboratory. Calibration. How do you know calibrations were done? We will do all the assessments described, which should catch any deviations from the plan. Corrective actions, because things are not going to happen as you plan them to, so there will be deviations from the plan that has to be documented. You'll have to make sure that the same problem doesn't reoccur. And what are the limits for how far things can deviate from the plan? So how much disagreement is tolerable in our side-by-side duplicate measurements? Then finally, are there any business rules or specific requirements in accordance with your grant or whatever agreement you're operating under? Basically, this element just says we will ask these questions of our data and our quality system. And then remember, the next element says these are the methods. Ba-ba!